Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Andrew and Jerry Save the World. This is episode 88, and it's a special episode for me and Jerry. We're going to be joined in just a moment by Patrick Maines. Jerry's going to get into his bio when we introduce him. He's got a storied career in free speech advocacy and analysis and discussing the relationship between free speech and politics and culture in America. We just had the conversation. We'll come back afterwards and sort of digest it, talk a little bit about the current events. But without further ado, here is our interview with Patrick Maines. One. Well, we are back, and this is an extra special part of today's episode. We're going to be joined in just a second by our guest. Jerry's going to introduce him. His name is Patrick Maines, but Jerry, tell us all a little bit about our guest.
Well, what's interesting about Patrick, before I introduce him, is that we're just a couple of weeks out from the 2024 presidential election. And leading into this election, at our radio programs, our different podcasting venues, Andrew and I have been focused on censorship, on free speech, on the exchange of ideas, on the idea of a more healthy public debate, how objectifying, dehumanizing your political opponents is dangerous for the republic. And so an opportunity presented itself from colleagues at Real Clear Politics to interview Patrick. Now, Patrick, I discovered earlier today, was once an assistant publisher at National Review.
Wow.
The magazine that really gave me an intellectual backbone, so to speak, when I first started at Fordham University. And but also he's the president emeritus at the Media Institute. He was president there for better than 30 years, Andrew.
Wow.
30 years in service to the movement of ideas, to the preservation of free speech and the exchange of ideas. And so it's really a great honor for Andrew and I to have Patrick on the podcast today. So, Patrick, why don't you introduce yourself and let our audience know, our viewers know. I said National Review, I said the Media Institute, but I know that you have a long resume of writing and thinking and doing. Why don't you say a couple of words about that?
Yeah, well, I thanks, Jerry. I have been writing for probably 20 years for a lot of different kinds of magazines, some of them online, some of them not. And I've written overwhelmingly about issues to do with politics and the media, or just the media in its own right. I have been consumed with the fact that while much conversation centers on the question of the free press, much less until recent days has focused on freedom of speech. And so it was for that reason that some years ago I created at the Media Institute, but as an independent operation, Free Speech Week.
Yeah.
It's now in its 19th year.
Wow.
And there's a website by that name, Free Speech Week. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And I have, as you know, I've written since retiring in 2017. I've written quite a few things for Real Clear Politics, but I haven't written for other magazines or newspapers since retiring.
Patrick, let me jump in because I am very, very much a free speech absolutist. That is, an essential liberty. Just had on at the beginning or just before Free Speech Week, had on UCLA law professor Gene Volokh on my radio show, who was getting ready to do a big thing at George Mason last Friday that I wanted to go to, but wound up not being able to. And on my last WCBM show of the most recent iteration, I'm going to say I stepped in it. I don't think I did, but I got crosswise with a lot of my listeners talking about the issue of flag burning. Somebody asked whether or not I thought that President Trump would push for a flag burning amendment. And I said, I hope not, because, to me, this is why we have free speech. Part of it is we need to be able to discuss ideas that we disagree with. But part of it also is we want the folks who have the most virulent, hateful ideas, we want them to call attention to themselves. We want folks to be able to burn flags because we want to know who those people are. We want folks who are spouting hateful ideas to feel free to spout them. Talk about, in the context of Free Speech Week, why this is so vital. Am I right? Am I wrong here? What are your thoughts?
I think you're right about the flag burning issue. And look, it's vital for primarily for this reason, that most of us learn things and express things through words. We don't do it through sounds. We don't do it through art. We pretty much everything we think about in words, even to ourselves. And so it's terribly important in terms of our general knowledge, not just in terms of the expression of our own points of view, that speech be free. And of course, in a democratic country, or the kind of democracy that we have here, it's vital, and for precisely the reason that you gave. And what's been alarming to me is that in recent years, I would say that I noticed it most dramatically in 2016, just around the time of the election, that the theories of suppression of that became widespread, and widespread most notably among people who were politically liberal. And so that's alarming. But in any case, to me, freedom of speech is the most fundamental aspect of the First Amendment. And not everybody owns a press, although increasingly a lot of people do, thanks to the internet.
Oh, yeah.
But everybody has a voice, and most can write and read. And so freedom of speech is, for that reason, just the most basic of our freedoms. And if it's being jeopardized as it is now, it really that jeopardy really needs to be confronted and reversed.
You mentioned freedom of the press, Patrick. Free speech, free press, free to exercise my faith or not exercise my faith. These are fundamental principles, American principles, that are in jeopardy, I think, today. But let me ask you this, because I have a little bit of a cheat sheet here, because you and I spoke earlier this morning. But talk about the news press, the legacy media, and how at one point, even though their editorial pages were slanted or biased, we understood that. We understood when we were reading a commentary piece that is commentary. But talk about how the news sections have changed, and how that impacts, again, the free exchange of ideas, how it impacts free speech.
Well, I'm glad you asked. In 1972, while I was at National Review, National Review published an article I co-authored called "Is It True What They Say About the New York Times?" Now, remember, this was 1972, over 50 years ago. And the piece that I co-authored wasn't an opinion piece. It was a content analysis of news coverage of prominent issues in the New York Times. And the surprising result of our content analysis, surprising even to us, was that as we looked at the Times coverage of a lot of issues that had a clear left-right split, we found that the New York Times on its news pages was really quite objective. And that contrasted with the New York Times editorial page, which clearly was not. That the publication of that piece was done at some cost. Bill Buckley got lots of criticism for allowing it to be published. I got lots of criticism. In fact, I got a death threat. So I actually ended up changing my phone number and unlisting it.
Wow.
But in any case, it's so clearly not true now. Now I haven't done a content analysis, so I can't cite chapter and verse, but I think it's pretty obvious. And the thing that really galls me is the claim by Rosenthal, by A.G. Rosenthal, the publisher of the New York Times, the claim that he made in the Washington Post in a lengthy op-ed piece that the Times is still committed to objectivity. I'll read to you, if I may, just a quote. At the Times, Rosenthal said, "We are committed to following the facts and presenting a full and accurate picture of November's election and the candidates and issues shaping it." I don't know what's more appalling to me about that Sulzberger believes that that statement is true, or that he knows it isn't true and it just feels like he needs to say it. Either way, it's false and just so appalling. But particularly in my case, since I had written so many years ago that piece defending the Times news coverage. And there's many things like this. In 2016, it was Ruttenberg, the New York Times reporter, who wrote a piece that basically said you don't have to be fair to or objective in your coverage of Trump because he says so many mean things and he's so much out of the ordinary for political or for presidential candidates. I wrote a piece at that time for The Hill, I think it was, saying that I wish I could find the title of the thing, but it was defending the indefensible bias at the New York Times. And so I would say that since at the latest 2016, it's been clear that that objectivity has not been the guiding principle in legacy media, and that's a great shame.
Patrick, I want to cycle back to this issue of free speech generally. Mm-hmm. And it was a couple of years ago, I had the fortune of interviewing Bob Levy from the Washington Post, former Washington Post columnist. As it happened, Bob Levy and I share the same pedigree in terms of high schools. We both went to very progressive high school up in the Bronx, the Fieldston School. And one of the things Bob talked about with me was his concern over the erosion of a commitment to free speech, to this free speech absolutism, First Amendment absolutism on the part of the left. Last week, Jerry, I think, rightly said that the election was a victory for liberalism. Talk about this erosion. Why have we had this erosion on the part of the left in their commitment to free speech principles? They don't want to debate. They don't want to have discussion of the facts anymore. And was last week's, or the election 2 weeks ago, was it a victory for liberalism? What are your thoughts here?
Well, I'm not. I'd have to think a bit about the last part of your question, but and are we asking why has the erosion taken place?
Yeah, why are
the left, or why has it taken place among the media?
Generally, why has the left abandoned their absolute commitment to the First Amendment and to free speech principles generally?
Well,
Patrick, before you answer, let me just throw this at you as you answer, and that is, I would say this. I would say that politics has become religion for the left. And therefore, if you oppose their positions, it's not about speech for them.
It's about faith.
It's apostasy.
Yes.
And what do you do with the heretic? You burn them at the stake. So, Patrick, as you're thinking this through, a religiosity impact caused the left to forget, again, their first love of free speech and liberalism?
Well, again, it's the reason I asked the question a moment ago. Are we talking about the left or about the media?
Yeah.
In the case of the media, I believe that as some ex-prominent New York Times executives have claimed, that the motive there is because their model, their revenue model is broken, and it was been broken by the internet and by things like podcasts and streaming media. And so
You did it, Andrew. You did it. You broke
well,
it.
listen, I'm always responsible for these things, Jerry.
I'm sorry, Patrick.
Yeah. No, that's why the media have it. That's the most prominent reason.
So for the legacy media, it's less about politics or even religiosity. It's more about it's money.
It's about trying to find a journalistic way forward.
Okay.
And that, sorry to say, in my opinion, is not going to be reversed. I think the legacy media are the only way that they're not going to be reformed. They're not going to suddenly adopt an objective model. The only way that would happen is if they're sold. You'll have to replace the entire editorial staff, and most importantly, you got to replace the people who own these companies, the people at the very top. And I don't see that happening, although maybe it's said now that MSNBC is for sale.
Well, Patrick, it's interesting because there's been some research that most Americans received their news this last election cycle through X, formerly known as Twitter. Right. And that was a big change in leadership. And there was a firing of the old guard. And so, again, and you just said MSNBC is, I saw the same thing, that it might be for sale. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, if Elon Musk, just as for instance, were to buy it, I think you would see MSNBC and MSNBC's journalism change quite a lot. But I wouldn't expect to see much of any change if it's the same crew owning it. I mean, so, it sticks in my craw a little bit that with any other kind of business that's misbehaving, the blame goes to the very top. But that's not the case with the media, because if you're unhappy with MSNBC, they'll talk about the writers or the reporters or the editors or the producers. But the person who can make the changes overnight is the head of Comcast.
Yeah.
Comcast owns MSNBC and NBC and CNBC. And so if he wanted to make changes, it would happen overnight. But he's been living with this for a long time, so he doesn't. But I never hear or read any criticism of him. Same thing can be said for CBS, ABC, the New York Times.
The Washington Post, right? Bezos and Amazon, sure.
Yeah. It would take up too much time for this interview, but I would tell you a somewhat contrary. I have a different feeling about Bezos. I think Bezos, and I think it's turning. I think Bezos is starting to get religion, so to speak. I don't think I expect big change at the Washington Post. Wow. And again, I think it'll probably be sold.
Again, the second part of Andrew's question, that is, so the media, the legacy media is behaving this way because of how does journalism move forward? Maybe we're looking at, look at the old boss look at the new boss, same as
the new boss, same as the old boss. Yeah.
Right. Because media at one time, think of how they were competing, newspapers, Republican, Democrat, that sort of thing. Maybe we're going back to that model. But let me ask you this, though. You distinguish between the media and the left. How has the left, or why has the left given up its commitment to free speech?
Because I think their commitment to free speech was predicated in the main just on a couple of issues that they found it sort of easy to get behind. Pornography was one. The the most famous case was the Nazi parade in
Yeah.
Illinois.
Skokie, Illinois. Yeah.
Yeah. But today, if free speech is understood to be, as the left does understand it to be now, the unimpeded expression of conservative or libertarian ideas and policies, then and moreover, if they appear to be dominant now, then the left has no interest in that, and so that's what I don't. In other words, to recap, I think they never had a pure, a purely disinterested view of free speech. And it's getting to be less true of them all the time.
So again, the paraphrase, what I think, the paraphrase, the left is more concerned with their ideas, and if their ideas or principles or their pursuit of power, if it aligns with the values of free speech, then they're in favor of free speech. If it does not, then they are not.
Let me simplify it. Hold on, Patrick.
Exactly.
Let me simplify it for a second, right? Free speech being used to advance things like Marxism, the various flavors of communism, socialism, etc., then they're going to go out and they're going to argue for free speech. Like every other socialist empire out there, once socialism becomes the predominant political, cultural movement, then of course they are going to silence anybody who dares criticize the Marxist-Leninist folks in power, right?
Yes.
So sorry, go ahead, Patrick.
No, I'm just, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. And that is the way I view it.
So Patrick, let me ask you this: your old shop, the Media Institute, but also are other organizations, individuals committed to free speech. How are we doing? How is the free speech movement doing? How is the Media Institute doing? What recommendations would you offer up? What constructive criticism would you offer up?
Let's see, which one of those questions you want me to answer?
Well, let's start with home. Let's start with the Media Institute.
I must say, and I certainly don't like saying it, but I'm dismayed by in my opinion, what's become of the Media Institute since my retirement 7 years ago. In that, I don't think they're doing. I mean, here we have probably one of the hottest cultural and political issues of our lifetimes, and I'm 81 years old, so that's a pretty long period of time in free speech. And it used to be a really big issue at the Media Institute, and I think it's not as big an issue since I left. And moreover, I think they're doing things that are actually hurtful to the Media Institute's background as a free speech organization. They've given awards to people that I would never have given awards to at their annual awards banquet. They have as the head of their free speech or First Amendment Advisory Council a person who is with the National Public Radio, which I think is just a shameful organization. And
hold on, Patrick. Nothing says a commitment to free speech more than a government-funded entity that parrots for the prevailing dominant political culture.
Yeah, but that's the irony.
Wow.
Are there any individuals, organizations you think are doing important work that we should spotlight, highlight them?
I right up at the top of my head, I can't think of organizations per se, but there are a potload of writers.
Yeah.
And some of them have gone, if I'm not mistaken, I think Matt Taibbi now is the second most widely prescribed author at Substack.
No, yeah, Lee Fang, Matt Taibbi. There's Jay Bhattacharya, who's a scientist. There's a whole group of scientists who are not public policy or political in any way, but because of the restrictions and censorship during COVID, they have at detriment to their careers.
Yeah, that's
They
right.
they
Right.
they have spoken out. Patrick, you may or may not know this, but the Real Clear Politics now has the Samostat Award that's given to a journalist or journalists who at great risk defend free speech, but also talk about what the mainstream, lack of a better term, leftist culture doesn't want us to talk about.
Hopefully funded, Jerry, by the Kriebel Foundation.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Any I'm not sure if Andrew has something, but we're taking a lot of your time here.
Yeah,
No,
I want to be really cognizant of that, Jerry.
Andrew, any last
No,
questions
I
or
mean, I just talk about the enduring importance of Free Speech Week, Patrick, if you would, because that is so vital. The recognition, the discussion that we have, it's not just important that we have the First Amendment and free speech, but we have to talk about why it's important, don't we?
we do. And some of these authors we've just mentioned and many that we haven't just mentioned are doing that. And people on the left are feeling the weight of that. I thought it was interesting to read in Real Clear Politics the story that was initially published in or maybe it was originally published in Real Clear
Real Clear?
Politics. No, about Michael Tomasky, the tremendous growth of right-wing media
Yeah.
is the real reason Trump won. I think it's powerful, and but again, I'm not looking so much to organizations except for
Right.
podcasts and streaming media and the like, and individual writers.
Well, Patrick, to your point, look at he's neither left nor right. He's a comedian turned UFC fighter enthusiast. Look at the impact Joe Rogan has
Right.
had on our
Oh,
public discussion,
tremendous,
right?
tremendous. Well, yeah, I mean, how many Rogan by himself, I would argue, has more political influence than the Washington Post.
I think you're I
I
think
think
you're
you're
100%
right.
correct. Yeah.
And let me add to this, right? It gets to what we've been talking about. The answer to speech you don't like is more speech.
Yeah,
Somebody going through and having 3-hour conversations with individuals to get at the meat of what they're talking about. That's exactly why we have the right to the free speech so protected as it is. But Patrick, listen, as Jerry said, we don't want to take up too much of your time. How do folks find out more about the good work you're doing and have been doing?
well, unfortunately, I'm not doing much good work anymore. I'm ill, and so I
Yeah.
haven't been writing anymore. And but I would say that wherever they can, they should subscribe to writers and commentators who are themselves committed to the promotion of free speech and are writing about that subject. And so, in some cases, you have to pay money
Yeah.
for a subscription. In many cases, you don't have to. And so I don't, not much of a chance for anybody to follow me anymore, but there's free speech has become a big issue. Anybody can talk about it, and lots of people are now talking about it. And so if you believe, as all of us do, that it's crucially important to the future of this country, then your listeners to this broadcast, my advice to them would be that they just get involved and in support of people that are themselves supporting and promoting freedom of speech.
It's like what Dickens said regarding Christmas in A Christmas Carol. It's not a one day a year thing. Carry it with you. Carry your commitment to free speech with you throughout the year, Patrick.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Before
thank you.
before
Sorry,
we
go
let
ahead.
Patrick, I just want to say one thing about Patrick, and I don't know Patrick. We met via email just recently, and I spoke to him for the first time today earlier, and I want to say something about his character in just the little time that I've known him now. The first thing Patrick asked me today was how is my father doing?
Yeah.
Patrick just alluded to the fact that he's fighting a health battle right now. And again, the first thing he said to me on the phone today was, my father has had a couple of strokes in the last 2 weeks. My dad is 86, Patrick. And the first thing Patrick asked me was, how's my dad? and how am I doing? And I appreciate that, Patrick. And I think that Fred Smith, our old mentor, Andrew and I from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, would say the cliche that many people have said before: people don't care what you know until they know that you care.
Yeah.
And I take more seriously what you're saying to us about free speech because I know you're a gentleman who cares,
Yeah.
and I appreciate that. And you know what? This interview will be transcribed and made into a special commentary piece for Real Clear. We're going to make sure that some of your previous writings, like I'm going to go back and look at the 1972 National Review piece on the content analysis, because what you wrote 30 years ago, 50 years ago, still is important today, and we'll look at linking to some of those old pieces in this article, so folks can look back and appreciate your legacy, the heritage that you created at the Media Institute. And so, congratulations on a job well done, Patrick.
You're here.
Well, Jerry, thank you very much for that. It means a lot to me.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick. We really appreciate it. You take care.
Thanks, and
All right.
best of luck to both of you.
Great.
Thank you, Patrick.
Well, boy, oh boy, Jerry. I mean, obviously that gets into one of my favorite topics to talk about, but the issue of free speech and free expression. As I made clear, I can listen. I can fanboy all over Patrick Maines as much as we want. These are the things I like talking about. As I said, my conversation with Gene Volokh,
Yeah.
the last week I was on the air, my very last show on WCBM for that iteration, and talking about the flag burning issue. Obviously, these are things that are near and dear to my heart. Let me just quickly come back to this, because you and I had a slightly different perspective on this about the issue of the left. And I like what Patrick had to say about the left really not really being committed to free speech, but being committed to the use of free speech as a way of achieving their ideological aims. And you and I both danced around it. Your thoughts on that here?
I have a couple. I remember being a kid, Andrew, and
I don't remember being a kid, Jerry.
And I remember, again, growing up in the Bronx and later when we moved to New Jersey, my father was very active. He coached baseball. He'd come outside and shoot hoops with me. And he would talk about things from a very kind of visceral perspective. The idea that the Soviets would never defeat us because too many of us are armed.
Yeah.
Right. Or he'd say something like, it was Khrushchev who said that he would sell us the rope by which we would hang ourselves. And so
Right.
my father understood that for the left, they would use our freedom against us.
Right.
And what protected us from that were those very same freedoms, like free speech, like free association, like the right to defend yourself.
Yeah.
And I find it very interesting that even an old school kid from the Bronx, from Irish immigrants who never graduated high school, would understand that. And I think Patrick has spent a career taking that visceral understanding and giving us the intellectual underpinnings for it, the intellectual arguments for it. And I think to that point, he has had a remarkable career.
Yes.
30 plus years of defending free speech. But, the publisher of Real Clear, David DeRozier, would say it's kind of like a trickle down civics, where if you don't have the Patrick
100%.
Maines, you're not going to have the Jerry Rogers, who kind of where it trickles down to. And let me just say one other thing, if you don't mind.
No.
Since we're I brought the subject of my childhood. I was struck that Patrick was an assistant publisher at National Review.
Yeah.
And here's why: because when I was a kid, I had certain principles. I was a conservative because I was a Christian.
Right.
right? But I didn't read Russell Kirk. I didn't read the great books. Not when I was a kid. I mean, a little bit in high school. I went to brought
Sure.
up Catholic, and so. But even there, it was in high school. It was Aquinas, not Russell Kirk. You know, he
Right.
said.
Yes.
So I knew Saint Jerome. I knew Aquinas. I knew less of the great conservative writers. But and here's the point of this. Back in the old days, in the late 80s, you know this, Andrew, there were
Yeah.
newsstands in New York.
Right.
And so I remember being in Manhattan. I'd come to Manhattan down from Fordham, and I was at a newsstand, this magazine caught my eye, and it was something about I think a cartoonish picture of Ted Kennedy was on the
Sure.
cover, and it said something like "raising the liberal plantation," something like that.
Yes.
And I picked it up, and I was like, oh my goodness, what? It was my introduction to National Review.
Sure.
And National Review is what set me off on reading the great books, reading
Yeah.
all of this, doing my homework to understand what conservatism is. And again, Patrick was part of that.
Yeah.
And I think
It's
that's
amazing when you
interesting.
go down that road.
Yeah. I
Sure.
mean, his work helped produce my work.
Right.
Yeah.
This is it's a now I'm really regretting we didn't sit down with David Bose before he passed because it's for me it was libertarianism a primer reading
Maybe,
that for the first time.
maybe Andrew and Jerry Save the World, moving forward into at the end of 2024, the beginning of 2025. Maybe we should make it a point. We started this program doing more interviews.
Right. And
Perhaps
no,
we
and
should try that again and
I think
bring in some of
what
these
you're talking
folks.
about is talking about these great thinkers because we
Yeah,
are losing them, right? Whether it's the R.J. Smiths of the world or the David Boses of the
the
world
Fred
or
Smiths.
whomever,
Yeah,
right? But that's exactly it. Sort of having these conversations with these folks. Michael Greva is a prime example.
yes,
And
yes.
I say this because I will never forget sitting down around the CEI conference room table with Michael Greva and having this discussion about free speech and the importance therein, and how we want the folks, the Nazis with the most abhorrent values out there, shouting out with essentially putting big, bright, hot pink neon signs above their heads that say, "Look at me, I'm an idiot." That's why you have this. And the other alternative is when you drive that speech underground, it allows it to fester. To me, the one of the most telling instances was when the head of the ACLU for Virginia was giving a speech at William and Mary. This has got to be 2017, 2018, and getting interrupted with the heckler's veto with people chanting ACLU, you protect Nazis too, as though that's a bad thing. This is where we are in America today. We have to have these discussions. What is a Nazi? Is Donald Trump a Nazi and an authoritarian? And we can't be afraid of having these discussions. Obviously, Donald Trump is not those things. But we have to have those discussions and not castigate those who want to have those discussions. And I think we've both hit on this issue, which is that once their viewpoint became the predominant political philosophy, well, then they moved to stifle debate and discussion, as all authoritarians do.
I think that it's also important to remember that the baton, so to speak, is being passed.
Right.
And so you have Jonathan Turley
Right.
writing about free speech and defending speech. You have Jay Bhattacharya, who is, again, a scientist, but also an advocate now for free speech because of
Right.
the COVID debacle. You have Matt Taibbi mentioned by Patrick in the interview, and Lee Fang. The interesting thing about Matt and Lee, they both come out of a more leftist
They do.
political environment,
Right.
and so it's almost like, remember again when we were younger. The neocon was the liberal mugged by reality,
Sure.
and they
The
became
David Mammoths of the world. Yeah.
right, exactly right. But there also seems to be a new kind of neo free speech advocate.
Right.
Progressives, for one reason or another, reality is hitting them. But the thing is, they're acting out. Who would have thought Elon Musk? Think about just
Right.
5 years. Who would have thought Elon Musk would be such a great advocate for free speech? Who would, Andrew? Think about when Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Right.
Dropped out of the presidential race in 2024. He gave one of the most eloquent defenses of free speech, and also described the problem of
100%.
the threats to the free speech. And I would never have thought a Kennedy would give that
Well,
speech.
listen, now I'm waiting for Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski to then turn around and have this
Right.
same
Well, let me ask you about that because
quiz.
I was going to mention that in our conversation. I think that there's something so disingenuous,
Oh,
but
100%.
but again, Patrick said it straight for me. Either Joe Scarborough was lying to us then when he was talking about Trump being a fascist, or he's lying to us now where he wants to reset the conversation with Trump. Because a fascist is a fascist is a fascist. But what did Patrick tell us?
It's all about the money.
It's all
It's
about the
all
money.
about the money,
And
boys.
that makes perfect
No
sense
Ray
to me.
me.
And Andrew,
Yes.
I'll throw this at you and you comment on it. I have no problem with the New York Times being a progressive paper.
Right.
I just don't like them gaslighting us, telling us it's not.
Right, of course,
You know what I mean?
and that which is exactly what he was talking about in
Yeah,
terms of Abe Rosenthal and Punch Sulzberger and
yeah,
sort of the masquerade there, right? And I think he's correct insofar as you see these changes, right? The changes at the Baltimore Sun, for instance, once that
yes.
was sold, and how they're sort of looking at these other voices out there, and Bezos, in terms of what he is going down the road
Well,
of doing.
and again, you bring up a good point
Thank
here
you,
because it shows you that many so-called journalists are not journalists, but rather advocates.
100%.
Because when Bezos makes the decision not to endorse a presidential candidate in 2024, you have an uproar, a mini revolution in his ed board among his editors and his writers. Well, I mean, my goodness. I mean, if they were about the journalism, they would just go out and be journalists.
Right.
But they're not. They want to be advocates. And I'll say this. Patrick mentioned that a lot of this came to a head and began or really became evident in 2016. I would say that journalists began to
Yes.
just strip off their facade of journalism during the McCain Barack Obama race,
I-
where journalists actually said that because of the historic nature of an African American running for office,
right.
that they had to put aside their journalism and become advocates for Barack Obama.
And essentially the same thing being done in 2024 with this election and Kamala Harris. One of the things I would have asked Patrick about was the culpability of so-called journalism schools in all of this, right? And the changeover there and how it used to be you'd be taught who, what, when, where, why, and how. Now you're being, now these journalism students are being taught how to use this bully platform, bully pulpit as a tool for advocacy there. I mean, that's and that's just it. That is a disservice to the American people. You're right, Jerry. And you teed it up well at the beginning of the interview, which is to recognize that there has always been bias and partisanship in these newspapers, but that gets into competition, right? Whether cities can support two newspapers. And
It also gets into an issue that you've raised, and that is the importance of anonymous giving.
yes.
Because
Oh yeah.
if you're running a hardcore progressive publication or a right-wing publication and you take controversial views, you don't want your donors to be in any way kind of banned
Right.
or penalized for being associated. And so the idea of anonymous giving, whether it's to organizations or to C3s or whomever, it's the act of giving anonymous resources, I think, is a critical part of the free speech movement.
Yeah, no, agreed wholeheartedly. So listen, let's shift gears a little bit, Jerry. While we,
Sure.
because we got a couple of minutes here to talk about what's been happening in the news Obviously, as we're talking about this, I don't know if you've seen it, but the New York Times is saying that there are now, I guess they're going to actually have interviews. Someone's going to come out with something bombshell about Matt Gaetz.
Thank you for mentioning that.
Please.
I want our audience to know something. There may or may not be reasons to oppose Matt Gaetz.
Yeah.
He ought to be vetted and he ought to be scrutinized by the United States Senate. However, let's tell the truth. And Molly Hemingway at the Federalist has done really good work here. The original Department of Justice investigation against Matt Gaetz was, some would say, an intimidation investigation. They wanted to silence him. You and I have talked about how
Right.
Matt Gaetz in Congress, in the capacity of oversight, has called out Merrick Merrick Garland, has
Merrick
called
Garland and yeah, the
and
DOJ and the FBI.
and the
Absolutely.
FBI, and their response was to come after him. Now, what people don't realize, and again, trust but verify, go and look at the reporting done by Molly Hemingway, and that is the investigation stalled and it was dropped because the witnesses were unreliable. And the only person who was ever brought up on any kind of charges was someone who was involved in a blackmail scheme.
Right.
And so, just because now a woman or a witness who was deemed unreliable by the Department of Justice is now saying that Matt Gaetz flew me here and did this there, the whole enterprise has to be called into question. And again, especially given the Kavanaugh hearings, where we know the left will use this kind of he said, she said, sexual abuse, Me Too attacks to get rid of threats to their power. Say what you want about Matt Gaetz.
No, listen, I just
He will go
reminded,
after. Yeah.
listen, I am reminded it's a movie, but movies are our great works. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Let's remember, you have this guy. Now, I'm not saying that Matt Gaetz is a Capra-esque character. I'm not saying that he's our modern day Jimmy Stewart. I'm not saying those things at all.
He's more like a Stan Lee character.
I am reminded of just the situation in which, Jefferson Smith, the Jimmy Stewart character in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, he utters the words "Willet Crick Dam," and then all of a sudden the political machine that he is about to upset the apple cart of, they reach in and they try to throw him out of the Senate there. So I tend to get a little bit cautious, especially in an environment in which we know that every single one of Donald Trump's nominees is going to be under scrutiny. And what the Democrats want is they want scalps, and they're going to get their scalps no matter what. Right. Sorry, go ahead.
And their problem now is that they have called Donald Trump a racist.
Right.
They have called him a fascist. They have said he's an insurrectionist. They have said he's an existential threat to our liberty. And it didn't work.
Yeah.
And so now doing the same to Pete Hegseth for defense secretary, or to Matt Gaetz, or to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Right.
It's just not going to work.
Right. And this is just it. I mean, as I said to you yesterday when we were talking about this stuff on the phone, time is a great thickener of things, as Lincoln says, to get another movie, a very Kafka-esque movie, the Spielberg Lincoln movie. Time is a great thickener of things. And I believe in this. And the problem we have now is we've got this news cycle in which it is just moving at the speed of light, and everybody either is expected to or wants to be first up the mountain with their right opinion. And that's a huge problem here.
What a head for knowing this Langer has.
Yeah.
I have said this to our friends. Again, there could be good reason to oppose Matt Gaetz. That reason hasn't presented itself yet.
No.
So why are you out ahead? This is unacceptable. This will never happen. He'll never get the votes. You don't know any of that.
Yeah.
I mean, my goodness, go back to 2015, 2016, right? We all said there's no way Donald Trump will ever
Right.
be president. And so this idea that you know something because you're a editor at whatever National Review or wherever is just keep your powder dry.
Right.
You know,
That's the key thing. And
and here's
focus on
yeah,
the fight ahead, which is
yes.
to make sure that the things that we want to do, we can actually get done and not get all drawn into the kabuki theater,
And this is how,
the
and
parlor games. Yeah.
this is how silly it's become, Andrew. You have Max Boot, who should have lost his column or his editorial position at the Washington Post. Max Boot, whose wife has been charged with, arrested for conspiracy and for international
That's right.
sabotage. I mean,
Espionage. Yeah.
espionage, sabotage. So I'm thinking of
Sabotage.
yes, but he has the audacity to criticize anyone.
Right.
I mean, this is someone who really should be putting his head down and moving forward. But it
Hey,
shows
hey,
you their own hubris will break them.
speaking of which, just in other sort of bright spots, not that we tend to dance on the graves of people's careers, but I'm
Right.
going to dance on the graves of people's careers. Ann Seltzer, the noted Iowa
Yes.
pollster, is stepping away. It was a planned retirement, Jerry. Of course, one of our good friends asked the question on election night, how much money was she paid to do this poll, and will that be enough to fund her retirement? So
Well,
Ann
but
Seltzer,
Andrew, that goes to
good
what we're
luck and
talking.
Godspeed.
But that's what we're talking about here, right? She offers up this poll. It is obviously an outlier,
Right,
given the previous year of polling. It was obviously a type of push poll or voter suppression poll to keep voters. Again, Iowa is next to Wisconsin, is next to
right.
Michigan, is next to Pennsylvania. This was a way to
Well,
suppress the
hold on.
vote.
Iowa's not next to Pennsylvania, only in the most tangential way, and
Well, I mean,
California is next to New
but
York. But yes,
no. I mean, it's different than that. I mean, it's like saying that Colorado is next to California.
okay, got it.
Yeah, I mean, right? I mean, and Colorado turned purple because of many Californians have left. My
Oh, I
point
see what
is,
you're saying. Okay,
yeah,
got it.
my point is that that poll was meant to suppress the vote in Western Pennsylvania, in Michigan, and in Wisconsin. And here's the point. Many of the people on our side use that poll to
Yes,
say, "Oh, imagine if it was only DeSantis.
right. Of course.
Imagine if it was Nikki Haley." And I'm thinking to myself, why are you taking what's obviously a bogus poll and using it to criticize the person who might be the incoming head of the Republican Party?
Right.
Again, just keep your powder dry.
Can I? And speaking of which, this is the only other thing, because we were running low on time here. Um, I just want to say this much. In the same way you and I have talked about folks engaging in mea culpas and accounting for themselves when they've done and said stupid things, in print or on the air, and not keeping their powder dry. For those of you who I know watch or listen to the show, and who, shall we say, were dead certain about things on social media going into this election, and then you promptly shut down your accounts after you were done, whether or not you locked them down and made them private, or you disappeared entirely from social media, don't think that it has gone unnoticed. Believe me, there are enough of you out there, including someone who tried to make a bet with me going into this. Now, listen. I said this leading up to the election. I know I'm a jinx. I think things are very close. I'm not going to make bets. But I'm at least, big enough to admit, something. Yeah, I'm out there. I'm not going to make. It's close. Anyway, that's where I am. Shame on you. Shame on all of you.
Yeah, again, I think that we need to be. It's so cliche, Andrew. The truth matters, right?
Yes.
Facts matter, data matters,
Free speech matters, Jerry.
free speech matters.
Yes. Well, listen, I appreciate the special. Jerry, you're on Sunday.
Indeed, I'm on Sunday. The assistant program director at WBAL contacted me this week. So, my show is podcasted. So go to
Yes.
WBAL.com and podcast and download the Jerry Rogers show. But he said that there were complaints that my podcast was too short. Because they take the 3 hour show and they
Yes.
condense it. They will do 40 minutes of it. So apparently this week they've allowed for more of Jerry.
There you
So
go.
I
That's
jokingly
good.
said with him, and he's a good boss. He's a good guy. I said the people just want more Jerry.
Yep, absolutely. Jerry's just
So
right.
Jerry's
They
just
want
right.
more of that. Listen, I've got a lunch hour podcast up. I talked with Kate Hudson this week from the Association of American Universities.
Oh, I thought you meant Kate Hudson, the movie star.
No, listen, yes, different Kate Hudson. I was misinformed.
Andrew,
Imagine my surprise when Kate Hudson wanted to talk about the Bayh-Dole Act.
I, I
Yes,
I have a very interesting business of America podcast that's up. I interview a scientist, a physician out of the University of Chicago about autoimmune issues.
nice.
And what's interesting about it is that it's definitely a kind of left-right conversation, and it's worth the listen. I think it's a good show.
All of these are well worth the listen. Jerry, what do you want folks to do?
Find the truth, plant your feet, and stand firm. God bless you.
God bless all of you. Have a great week, everybody. Have fun and please stay safe.